Have you ever taken a minute to think about the mental gymnastics required of someone who is actively oppressing a person or a group of people? And if you hadn't, completely understandable, especially if you're someone who has experienced oppression. However, it is actually an important perspective to consider when we're having the conversation about white supremacy and what it looks like in action. And that is what they really do a interesting and I think effective job of discussing in episode 2 of Exterminate All the Brutes. So let's get into it. So episode 2 of Exterminate All the Brutes, what it does for me, kind of what I took away from it was it continued to tell the story of, what white supremacy in action, but it gave us some justifications that white people used to kind of systemically oppress and brutalize the brown populations that they encountered in the various places where they visited, where they basically showed up to conquer. And I think it's important to understand those justifications, not because we were empathizing with the oppressor. That's not what it is. It's more so important to understand the justifications because it helps us to better see what it looks like when white supremacy is like what it looks like in action when it's happening versus as kind of this general term that addresses the idea that white people are better than others. And so I think that is what makes it important and valuable because it's tough to kind of dismantle and actively work against these institutions and white supremacy in general if you don't recognize what it looks like when it's happening in all of the various ways that it can look like. So I think I said in the last video about how, there's this whole thing is like, you're not virulently racist where you're like, wearing a hood and having a burning cross strapped to your car or, in your truck strapped to your car. I don't think people do that, but you know what I'm saying? Like these very violent, aggressive images of, white supremacy and racism, like if you're not doing that or, when they show us visuals of the Holocaust genocide, in how, you see like children and families and people being actively, murdered and exterminated essentially. That is what a lot of people think when they're like, well, I'm not that. And it's like, right, you're not that. But you are one or two, maybe three justifications away from becoming that, but you're still this. And this is that thinly veiled stuff that is kind of the pinpricks. It's the death by 1,000 pinpricks versus you just showing up and, actively chopping someone's head off with an axe, for lack of a better, trying to stick with my metaphor here. So what we got to see in this episode, which is very aptly titled, Who the F is Columbus? We got to see how white people have justified white supremacy. And it started from the very beginning because, as I said in the last video, where I was talking about how they would use religion to get people to go out and, battle and fight and, show up to try to force people to be Christians because that religion is the way for that particular group. You can get people to do some very heinous things if you can inspire them enough. And religion is one way to inspire people to do some very heinous things under the guise of, religion. Well, this episode gives us a very interesting glimpse or just begins to pull back the curtain behind the justifications that were made in order to excuse or to explain or to provide reason for the white supremacist behaviors and the oppressive behaviors. And so it starts off with the whole idea of whoever wins gets to tell the story. So first you have to understand that, whoever controls the narrative can and ultimately control the outcome, because the thing that will last and the thing that will sustain is the narrative, the telling of the story, not necessarily the events themselves. It is how the events are described and explained to other people who were not there. And if you are the one telling the story, and you're telling the story as if you are the person who has won, succeeded, and are the victor, even if you were not, then you're the one who wins. And a really great example that they use in the episode is the story of the Alamo, that storied battle in what is now present day Texas between the settlers and the Mexican army, where essentially the Mexican army killed a lot of people. They basically came through and just they won. They destroyed everything. They won. They were victorious. However, because the people who tell the story are the people who are descendants of those settlers, what the story becomes, and even in the movie about the Alamo, it becomes kind of a rallying cry, a moment for inspiration. So while they lost that battle, they used that to, ultimately win the war, essentially. And I'm using finger quotes because they didn't really win the war. They weren't able to really take over Mexico. The border clearly was nah, we're here. You're not going to go much further. And that border has held for, a couple of centuries, decades. But if you look at the stories of the Alamo, we have you believe it was they were martyrs for the cause of, the growth of this burgeoning country that is the United States of America. And that is what we learn in history books, and that in history class in this country, that is what we experience. But that's not really the true perspective. And so I'm sure if you have an American kid, or from a kid who's from the United States, finds their self in Mexico, and going to school and learning Mexican history, because for them that would be just history. For us, American history, we have American history, but we also just have history, and they would learn, it's very likely, me without having done any, having read a history book in Mexico, that they would see a different story. And it could possibly cause some confusion and cognitive dissonance that would be tough to reconcile for someone who is, essentially a tween, a teen, depending on what age they are. And so I think it is just important to remember that the people who are telling the story are the people that can paint themselves in the most effective light. And we just need more perspectives to be telling these stories. And so it was very interesting for that perspective. But what I found enlightening was just how the different ways that white supremacy has been baked into society. And the reason why it's baked in is because it benefits the white supremacists. They've been, not just for egotistical purposes, even though that's one of them, but also practically. European settlers show up to these various lands that they come across in their journeys, because they didn't discover anything. They came across them in their journey, and they're what and so it's important to keep in mind that oftentimes these explorers were going out in search of gold and riches. So these are essentially wealthy people who who have a trade, but they're wealthy. So really they have the capabilities to have a boat and to go out essentially in search of adventure. And of course, if you are successful in your search of adventure, you can come back and bring, you can introduce your countrymen to all of these exotic foods and, cloths and minerals and things, but you can also find riches. And so it's essentially a bunch of treasure hunters who also are merchants, but ultimately they're just treasure hunters who are out there trying to find the next big pot of gold. And they go out in search of that. So that's their intention. So their intention is wherever they get to, they know that there's got to be gold there because one, they didn't even know, like Columbus didn't even know where he had landed. He thought he was in on the Asian continent, but he hadn't made it there yet. So he would have eventually gotten there if he had stayed in the water and gone around those lands. But he didn't know that. So he thinks he's at a place that has been proven to be filled with gold and riches and all of these valuable things that he can then take back to Spain and sell, show off, lace his own crib, whatever with. But that intention is greedy, and it's very much like, I'm showing up here to take what I can get. I want to take. So it's a very take mentality. So when they show up and there are these people that get in their way, they're going to do whatever they have to do to get those people out of their way. And then when the era of chattel slavery began, then it became about, it was about, the trade and the goods and the services of the, that they were using the different people for. But still, there's an element of greed. It's like, we just want, and we're going to do whatever we can do to get what we want from here. And so they realized, okay, we're here. And for some reason, they found kinship with the natives. And they felt like that the natives, who they called savages, shouldn't be treated the way that they were being treated, and they shouldn't be killed, and the way that they were being killed. This happened in 1501. But there was a preach who, I think his name was Jean Daniel, who Verhey. I'm killing that. I apologize. I will put it in the comments spelled out. But he was, writing like, we shouldn't be killing the natives, who they call savages. But the barbarians, who were the people who from the continent of Africa, they're not like all the way, they're not human like how we're human. So let's let the natives free. But the barbarians, the folks from the African continent, they need to be enslaved because they're less than human. And so we're just going to use their labor. And that was the first instance of colorism, in my opinion. I was like, that's the first instance of colorism as a caste system that we see in the Americas. And as I saw that part of the documentary, I was like, yo, that is bananas, and feels so interesting. And interesting is just kind of all I got for some of these things, because I'm blown. But interesting, for lack of a better term. And another thing that it talked about was the different revolutions that happened. You had the American Revolution, you had the, I'm drawing a complete blank on the other revolution, but then what you don't hear when they're and these revolutions were essentially, the colonies of the superpower, which was Europe at the time, breaking away and creating their own community. And so with the American Revolution, it was like, yeah, cheers, America. But the same thing happened in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, where the Haitian population rose up against the French who was occupying them and was like, nope, and proceeded to take back their country. That revolution is not discussed in the same context as the American Revolution. Do we wonder why? Or do we already know? It was Black people. So you don't hear about, the skill and the cunning and what it took for them to take back their entire country from this invading class. You don't hear about that. You barely hear about the Haitian Revolution at all. Like, they just have completely figured out how to erase that from the conversation, because it's hard to reframe that. Like, the French, they killed everybody and was like, and we're taking it back. Now, what I've read up on just kind of the Haitian Revolution and what happened after, and how Haiti ended up where it is today, where it is a developing nation, even though it would make more sense based on just learning about the Haitian Revolution that Haiti would be more of a superpower in the political landscape, but it isn't, because again, white supremacy came in and was like, oh, how dare these black people think that they can raise up and take back their own land? How dare they do that? So we're going to, hit them where it hurts, and we're going to, trade and access, and so we're going to make it. And they, my apologies. I've said I have a lot of notes. I have a lot of notes here that I use, because I am not like a historian. People that can like know facts and just spew them. I find those people so inspirational, because that's not me. But in the story of, so this is a very loose breakdown of that story, where Haiti was basically, they were forced to owe a debt to France because of because the enslaved people on Haiti were considered, property of France. And so by killing all of the oppressors and taking back the island, they essentially took money out of France's pocket. And so France was able to levy like an aggressive tax over them that made it damn near impossible for Haiti to ever like get a foothold. So that whole generational wealth thing, like, white people have been taking generational wealth away from black people for sure, from like the jump, which is why the people who have, if you come across black people with generational wealth, they're often not from America. They're often from the continent, where they have like true generational wealth. Like, yes, there are some black families who have old money, which is essentially what generational wealth is. But there are way more people from the continent of Africa who can have generational wealth, who can send their children to the Americas to study and possibly start businesses and all of that good stuff. So you don't really see that because of white supremacy and institutionalized racism. They put institutions in place so that not only could those of our ancestors not actually have money in the moment, they're not going to even be able to build money to be able to help their families down the line. And that was one of them. The way that France essentially punished, not even quote unquote, they punished Haiti for taking its independence in a way that America was not punished by England for taking its independence. So that is just one example of many in this episode, just kind of about how the narrative is told. And another thing that I found interesting was something that I knew to be true, but it's good for me, I think, to see this explained. The whole idea, I know I mentioned in the last video how Jewish people like just became considered white in fairly recent times. I don't know the exact date, but in my lifetime and in my mother's and grandmother's lifetimes, but there was a time when they were considered ethnic, but not white. So it talks about the Irish and how England, and so this tactic of coming to this land, taking over the land, and then oppressing the people by dehumanizing them is something that England rinse and repeat. They, like I said, when they finally got to the Americas and the way that they took over the Americas, that was a tactic they had been perfecting, because in 1600s they invaded Ireland, and the way that they were able to justify their oppression of the Irish was that they said that the Irish descended from apes, but the English descended from man. And they were able to use the idea in science that there were more than one species of Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens, more than one species of human, because everybody wasn't a Homo sapien. That was the one that survived and kind of led to us. But there were others, and there are actually others that exist now in the I'm drawing a blank. I'm going to drop it below, because I actually did a video about a man named Otabanga, and he was a Central African forager. And they are actually genetically different from like Homo sapiens. They're a different form of man. We're all men, we're all human. Because, like their stature is smaller, they have some slight genetic differences. And so there are people who are genetically different, but they're humans that exist today. So, but there is like a scientific idea that we just, there were more, and some of them survived, some of them didn't. And so this scientific racism, essentially what it's called, is how the English are able to oppress the Irish, because they're like, oh, the Irish, they descended from a different type of human. We are the more evolved. And they did the exact same thing with the enslaved people, the enslaved population, Black people. And so it was nice and affirming for me to see that, because it's something that I have learned and heard about, but seeing it kind of broken down like that was like, oh, right, of course, that's that scientific racism, because Irish are another group of people that, again, were not considered white. They were considered ethnic. And in the 1600s, because England had basically decided that it wanted to take over Ireland, a lot of Calvinist Irish people came to the Americas to escape persecution. So when they got here, there was the Irish, there was other non-white considered immigrants who immigrated to the Americas. They quickly saw, okay, in order for us to be successful over here, to thrive, we have got to assimilate. And one of the ways that they needed to assimilate with white culture, the white population, was they had to share their oppressions. So they had to oppress the same people that they were oppressing. And in order to do that, and in order to pledge their loyalty to the U.S., and so this is something that I pulled directly from the documentary, in order to pledge their loyalty to the U.S., non-white immigrants had to oppress the three groups in the Americas who were not immigrants. So, and those groups were the enslaved Africans, the natives, and Mexicans. So when people say, this is something that really, that kind of bothers me, they say that we are a country of immigrants. That statement is an erasure of enslaved Africans, who are my direct ancestors, the natives who already lived here, and the Mexicans who were also natives. They were just natives of Mexico. We've been here. They've been here. We were brought here against our will. We didn't hop on it. We didn't say, I want to go to the Americas to, escape persecution, or to have a different life experience, or to do better as a people. We were stolen. We were stolen from our lands and brought here against our will, and killed in the process. So that is the whole idea. We are a nation of immigrants. When people refer to America, that is a form of white supremacy. And that is one of those nuanced things. And when people say it, who are immigrants, and if you argue with them and you say, we actually aren't all immigrants, they get offended, because that's how they find kinship with the white people who were immigrants, who came here, because those are the white supremacists, the white people who, benefit from and play into the idea of white supremacy. In order to be successful here, you have to assimilate into that. And so when immigrants, who, especially non-white immigrants, who come here and they're like, of course, we're a nation of immigrants, and it makes them feel good, but in doing so, they completely erase the ancestral experience of the enslaved, the black people who, who came from who are the ancestors, I'm losing words, sorry, who are the ancestors of the enslaved Africans who were stolen from the continent of Africa from various countries and brought here against their will. The natives who were already here and who were killed and almost completely destroyed as a people in order to get rid of, and also the Mexicans who were also already here and who were attacked and they tried to kill and get rid of. And so by saying that, you erase that experience and you are playing into white supremacy. So so you can still say, this is a country, I think even just tweaking it, saying this is a country this is a country that is friendly to immigrants, even though that's also not true. So you know what? I don't know how to fix that, but that's an erasure. And it is a result of white supremacy. And so if you think about that perspective, then it kind of makes what happens and the experience that some people have in this country, I mean America, United States of America, you can maybe understand why some people feel the way that they feel about different groups, especially the idea that in order to pledge your loyalty to this place that you have come to, because a lot of people who came to the Americas in those early centuries, early decades, were doing so to escape something that was happening in their home country. So they came here to get away from something bad, start anew, and then they realized the way they were going to be successful is that we have to assimilate in some capacity. We could keep some things, but other things we have to take. And one of the things that it seems was easiest for them to take was the oppression. And it was a lot, and it was very affirming to see that written down, especially knowing that Raoul Peck, the filmmaker, is an immigrant. He is he's Haitian. He's from Haiti. And he's lived a very kind of expatriated life. It looks like there are some home videos that he shares in the documentary, in this episode, and all the different countries that he had lived in and these different experiences. And so having him essentially make that statement, make that declaration for someone like me, it was nice and affirming. So what did you think about episode 2? There were so many other things I wrote about, just the idea of people who are the genocidists. So those are the European settlers who came and had to act and had to oppress these people, that they had to tell themselves something about why they were doing it. And so in order to convince yourself that what you're doing makes sense, telling yourself that the people are less than human is one way to do that. And you have to really buy into that. Otherwise, you feel terrible because you are terrible. If you can do those things to someone actively, to a human being, that's terrible. That's a terrible person. And so shame, a lot of this is rooted in shame. And it's hard to shake what you do to justify and make yourself not feel shame. Have you ever seen somebody trying to save face? Something that they do wrong or bad, and they don't want to take responsibility because they don't want to look bad. And I have seen people lay in bad decisions and lay in poor takes just to save face. And essentially that is a lot of what we experience with white supremacy, the nuanced things, not the big things, those are also it, but those are easy. This documentary helps us explore the hard things. So what did you think? What did you notice? There's so much, it's chock full. I have a lot of notes. Like I said, these recaps could be, an hour long easy, and I don't want that if I talked about everything. So what did you pick up? What did you notice? What did you take away from this episode? And yeah, let's talk about it in the comments. And I'll be back for episode 3 and to share my thoughts there. But in the meantime, talk about episode 2. There's some links that I'm sharing below. There's also a cool syllabus that they've included with this documentary with readings so that you can do some additional research afterwards to learn even more. But I am looking forward to this. I'm learning a lot. I'm looking forward to more conversations in the comments, and I look forward to the next time that we can chat again about episode 3 of Exterminate All the Brutes. Bye.